Hello and welcome back to the MVPDays 2019 Azure Stack and Azure Stack HCI Day. My name is Kenny and I'm here to talk to you about the Azure App Service for the Azure Stack Operator. You can hit me up on Twitter at Kenny Lowe, and I work in the Azure Stack Product Technology team for Dell EMC. Now, before we delve into what's going to be a very demo-heavy session, I wanted to do a little bit of scene setting first. It's true to say that hybrid is something we've spoken about as an industry for many, many years now, but it's never really lived up to the expectations of what has been described. And true hybrid is really consistent to the core, consistent wherever you deploy. So hybrid cloud on premises and in the public cloud should be the same. You should have the same capabilities or broadly consistent capabilities at the very least. If you're using two different cloud platforms with two different ways of managing them, two different sets of skills required, and different capabilities, that's a multi-cloud world where you have two different cloud environments which have the same skills, the same tools, the same capabilities, the same way of managing. That's a hybrid cloud environment there. And Microsoft's vision really across these four pillars you see on the screen is to bring hybrid to the on-prem and public cloud world wherever possible. So this is true across identity, across security and management, across data platform, and across what we really care about today, which is Azure and Azure Stack, the unified development, DevOps, and IT Pro environments. The whole goal of Azure Stack is to give both developers and IT pros a consistent experience both on premises and in the public cloud so that you don't have to worry about how you're going to do things or rewriting or refactoring applications or reskilling and retraining to manage applications or resources in different locations. One set of skills, one set of applications, one set of tools is designed to do you across the board. And we really work from the top down when it comes to Azure and Azure Stack, looking at the portal experience, the PowerShell and DevOps tooling experience, down through Azure Resource Manager, then down into the services beneath that, rather than the traditional on-premises world, where we'd look from the bottom up and think, okay, what's my my hardware, what's my IOPS, what's my compute, my storage. No, we work from the top down in Azure Stack rather than the bottom up. And while we have a number of different Azure services available in Azure Stack today, it is true that we don't have all of them available, and actually we never will. Some Azure services are really designed for massive scale, some just don't make sense to run on premises as well. But those that we do have tend to be those which are the most sought after and the most used. And that we're going to talk about today, the Azure App Service, is a tier 1 application in the public Azure cloud. It's one of the first applications to be, or well, first services to be deployed into a new Azure region as soon as it comes online, because it's one of the most highly valued, most widely used, and most valuable services available in public Azure today. If we log straight into the public Azure portal, we can go into our app service plan here and start to have a look at what makes up the Azure App Service. Now, the Azure App Service is a way for running web applications in the cloud. It's a way to abstract you away from having to think about and manage virtual machines and IaaS and constructs like that, and instead care more about management and scalability and resiliency and deploying the application and how you manage the application. It elevates you away from IaaS into the world of PaaS. Now, an app service is made up of two components. It's made up of an app service plan, and it's made up of an app service. Now, the app service plan describes the infrastructure on which your application is going to run. In the on-premises world, in the traditional world, this would be the virtual machines and the IaaS service running on top of those virtual machines. The first thing you need to do is deploy an app service plan. I have one ready created here. When you create your app service plan, one of the first things that you do is you describe what that infrastructure should look like. So what is the compute resource that it's going to need? How many instances of VMs are you going to need? What does the scalability look like? And you're given a few set pricing tiers that you can choose from. So for dev test workloads, you can choose from the free series here, or the basic series, or the D series here. For production, you can move into the standard or premium tiers here. And the difference between these is the amount of RAM that you have available, the amount of compute that you have available, and it's also the number of features that you have available as well. So if we look at the dev test free tier here, underneath it you can see there are effectively no features available. What you get is a very basic web application plan which allows you to run a very basic web app. If we move on to the basic tier here, you see we start to unlock some features for a little more money. We can now do custom domains and SSL certificates. We can do manual scale of up to 3 instances, and an instance here represents a virtual machine in the back end. You don't see them, you don't manage them, but they are there. So here we can scale up to 3 instances of this web application. And then if we move on to the production workloads, we can see that in the S1 tier here, we get a few additional capabilities as well. We can now do up to 5 staging slots. We can back up our workloads. We can use Traffic Manager. We can scale up to 10 instances. The difference really, as you go up these different tiers, is in the amount of compute and in the features that you have available. And when you deploy a web application, you choose what's most appropriate for the scenario that you're trying to achieve. Now, if you find that you deploy the wrong tier, that's very easy to change. You just pick the new one that you want and you click apply, and the web application will update automatically for you, taking advantage of these new features. Once you've deployed your app service plan, you then go and deploy your application itself, and the application is just what would run inside your IaaS directory in the traditional on-premises world. And once you've deployed your Azure App Service, you can then browse to it, you can see it, you can secure it with SSL, you can stick it behind Traffic Manager, you can do all sorts of interesting things. You can monitor the traffic, you can give it different deployment slots, you can add SSL certificates, you can do all sorts of interesting things with it. But the goal of this session is not to delve deep into the app service from a tenant perspective. The goal of this session is to delve deep into the app service from an admin perspective in Azure Stack. Now, before we do that, let's just marry up that consistency story and look at the Azure App Service in Azure Stack as well. If you look here, I've flicked across to my Azure Stack service. You can tell that because it's got a different URL here, and it says Microsoft Azure Stack. This is running on hardware about 5 feet behind me now, rather than in the Public Azure cloud. But you can see it looks pretty much exactly consistent with Public Azure. If I click into my app service plans in Azure Stack, you'll see I have no app service plans currently created. But if I go and create one, it's going to ask me for a few basic things. So I will give it a name. I will choose a subscription to deploy into. I will give it a resource group. And I have to choose a pricing tier, exactly the same as in Public Azure. Again, we have our options between F and D, Dev Test, Production, S series here, and again the difference between these is in included features and amount of compute resource available. Here we will pick the S1 series here and click apply. Click create, and very rapidly this app service plan is going to be created. There are no virtual machines which need to be deployed here. The app service has virtual machines already pre-deployed, ready to be allocated to you when you go and create an app service plan. It's an incredibly rapid way to provision a new web application. Within around about 15 seconds or so, even less, the deployment is complete, and we can click straight into this application here. Again, I can scale this out to multiple instances here if I have the capability to do that, or I can scale it up if I've decided I've chosen the wrong app service plan type here. I could make it an S2, for example, because I need to have 3.5 gigs of memory per host rather than 2 gigs of memory, because I miscalculated when I was sizing it. After that, I can create my web application. Easy way to create an app service is to go Add, choose to create a new web app, click Create, give it a name, give it a subscription. I need to be an appropriate subscription to give it a name. Use the same resource group as I currently have deployed. Choose the app service plan, which I previously deployed, and click Create. And within about 5 to 10 seconds, we're going to have a web application up and running on a managed service where you never have to log into a VM, you don't have to manage IaaS, you don't have to do the patch and update, you don't have to manage the scalability, you don't have to worry about load balancing. All of that's handled for you. And almost immediately, our web application is up and running, and we can browse to it. MVPDays.appservice.local.azurestack.external. App service is up and running. Now, there are some interesting things that we can do with this. For example, we can start building in deployment slots. And the deployment slot allows you to do run a different version of the web application, for example, a UAT version or a dev test one, and very easily switch between that and your production one for testing purposes. So if I add a slot here, I will call this UAT. I'll clone my settings from my existing application. And again, in about 3 seconds, I have a new deployment slot here. Now, I can link these back to my GitHub repo or to my GitLab repo or to Bitbucket or whatever deployment source I'm using. And I can set whatever traffic I want to go to these to do some proper A/B testing. So let's say I've just finished my UAT testing. I want to start bringing my customer traffic in through my new version of the web application. This doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. I can say, I'm going to put 5% of my traffic through this deployment slot here. And gradually over time, I'm going to ramp that up until I'm very happy with the results I'm getting. I'm happy there are no breaking changes. I'm happy that the customer experience is going to be great. At which point I can just swap these slots over. And my UAT becomes my production, and my production becomes my UAT, and on we go with our lives, and everything's wonderful. It is that easy. The contents of the UAT slot are going to move into the production one, and vice versa, with a couple of clicks here. We can configure custom domains, we can configure backups, we can do all sorts of things very easily within the app service here, but that's the same as in Azure. That's no different. That's what you'd expect from the Azure app service. What about different things? I mean, the goal of Azure is to be consistent with Azure Stack, but actually one of the most interesting things about the app service in Azure Stack is where it goes a little bit beyond what you can do in Public Azure. It gives you a few additional capabilities. So if I jump over to my Azure Stack admin portal here, and this is a unique feature within Azure Stack. The Public Azure portal doesn't have this administration portal. This is for backend management of Azure Stack. In Public Azure, Microsoft do all this. In Azure Stack, you have to do some of the backend management. It's not particularly onerous, but it is a task to be aware of. The person that does this task, we call the Azure Stack Operator. So if I click into the admin pane for the app service here, you'll see there are a number of things which I have control over and I can configure. So for example, one of the things I have to manage is certificate rotation. So if I was to go back to my web application which I just deployed here, you'll see that it's an HTTPS website. It is already secured. I didn't have to create a certificate for it. This is managed by the Azure App Service itself, but you have to provide it with the certificate with which to do that. So you'll want to rotate these on a regular basis. In order to rotate the certificates in your app service here, you simply go to rotate, you upload your new certificates, you click OK, and that's it done. It's a task for you to do, but it's not a particularly onerous one. Similarly, there are some backend encryption keys, connection strings, system credentials, which you want to rotate on a regular basis for security reasons, and it tells you roughly when you should do this. 179 days for the encryption keys. Well, let's just do them just now, because all you do is rotate, OK, and that will go ahead and do it for you. Nothing particularly onerous there. I said earlier that you can connect your web applications to different source control, things like GitHub, GitLab, OneDrive, Dropbox, things like that. In order to do that, you need to, first of all, create an OAuth token for these different services. So for GitHub, what you need to do is you'll need to log into your GitHub account, go to Settings, to Developer Settings, OAuth Apps, and create a new OAuth app. Once you've created an OAuth application, it'll give you a client ID and a client secret. I have revoked the secret since creating this, so don't try and use it. And once you've done that, you can fill those into your GitHub secrets area here. And once you've done that, your tenants are then able to log in and manage GitHub with their own credentials. This is purely for managing authentication between the Azure Stack and GitHub, not your tenant application and their GitHub repos. This allows that communication to take place. After you configure your source control configuration, we can have a look and see what goes on behind the scenes a little in the Azure App Service here. There are a bunch of virtual machines which control the infrastructure behind the scenes. There are controller VMs and management server VMs and front-end VMs, the publishers. And in the Azure Stack Developer Kit here, this is limited to one instance of each. In a production version of Azure Stack, you have multiple instances of these which you can use for resiliency. Now, you don't log into these VMs, you don't manage them, you don't take care of them. The Azure App Service does that for you. One thing that you do need to take a bit more care of, though, is your web worker VMs. So here you'll see that I've got 4 web workers, small, shared, medium, and large. And then I've got one instance of each of these deployed. Now, these are the virtual machines which run behind your application. So these are the VMs which support the app service plans that you're deploying. And these are the different tiers which have been created in the Azure Stack here. If I click into the worker tier section here, I can see the different worker tiers which I have deployed here. Now, if you remember back to Public Azure and Azure Stack, when we're selecting which tier we're deploying, there are different amounts of compute and RAM and storage available behind the scenes here. And these are associated with different VM sizes here. So if we look in the shared tier here, we can see this uses a standard A2. The small, medium, large here use standard A1 v2, standard A2, and standard A3, and they use a 2016 Data Center Edition image for the VMs themselves. Now, in Public Azure, the resources which you have made available at the start are what you can use. You can't change them. You can only use what Microsoft make available to you. Because you manage Azure Stack, you have the options and the capabilities to create your own worker tiers, to define what right looks like for you. One of the great problems that we sometimes see with Public Azure in the app service is that it's really designed for this idea of scale out, not scale up. This Azure App Service can only scale to a certain level. In fact, if we log into our Azure portal again and we look at the app service plan and we see how big we can scale our existing app service, the largest VM available has 14 gigabytes of memory, equivalent of 840 Azure compute units, which is a lower amount of CPU, and it runs on a DV2 series compute equivalent here. That's the maximum that you can get in a VM in Public Azure. But what if your web application is extremely RAM hungry? What if you need to have 20 gigs of memory, 40 gigs of memory? Well, the traditional way of doing that in Public Azure would be to scale out and have multiple instances of these VMs and have load balancing going on automatically across these. But not every application is suited for doing that. Not every web application is able to scale out. In the on-premises world, our traditional way of solving resource contention is to add more resource to a VM. We give it more RAM, we give it more CPU, we give it more storage, we give it more IOPS. That's what a lot of applications that we're looking to lift and shift from on-premises into the app service are designed to do. And for those applications, actually the Azure App Service requires that application to be rewritten to take advantage of scale out, not scale up. What we can do in Azure Stack, because you're in control, is we can create our own worker tier. So we can say, let's have a gigantic worker tier. We'll make sure it's a dedicated one. If I have different compute images here, I could say this could be a 2019 data center image instead, for example. And then I can use basically whatever compute VM size I want. If my application is going to require 128 gigs of RAM and 64 cores, by all means, go ahead, create it. That's going to create my worker tier, and in short order, I'm going to be able to deploy my web applications against that now, not just the ones which have been predefined for me. That's going to deploy, become ready, and once it's ready, I can make use of it. Each of these worker tiers here is a VM scale set. Right now, you'll see that I have one total large VM of it in total and one available. If I want to have more than that, for example, I know my users are going to need to be able to scale to 10 instances, then all I need to do is go into the VM scale set, choose scaling, and choose how many I want to be available behind the scenes. Now, I'm not going to do 100 because I don't have resource for that, but let's say 10 VMs, that's fine. What that's going to do is allow 10 dedicated large instances to be deployed in my Azure Stack. Again, that's going to deploy new ones. And then once they're ready, I'll be able to make use of them. This is a unique concept within Azure Stack versus Public Azure. In Public Azure, you work with what you're given. In Azure Stack, you can almost mold the environment to suit your requirements. You can make it work for you. You don't have to work for it. If we look at the SKUs available, again, we have free, shared, and standard. These are consistent with Public Azure, but maybe that doesn't make sense for you. Maybe this should be called Dev Test, UAT, and Production. And those are the three different SKUs that you use. In Public Azure, the pricing is set for you as well. So you pay what Microsoft says you should pay. Now, in Azure Stack, it's slightly different because you own the hardware. And there are a few different licensing scenarios here, which I won't delve too deep into. But if you're providing the Azure App Service as a service to your customers, be they internal customers who require chargeback, or in a CSP model to your end users within your data center, you're going to want to charge them for these services. And you don't necessarily want to charge them the same as Microsoft charges. So you have the option to choose how much each of these different SKUs costs as well. So I've been very generous and said that my free tier costs £1. I probably shouldn't do that. Free should mean free. Let's make sure that that is 0 USD, use 0 GBP per month, save it, and now that'll be updated. In fact, if I go back to my portal here and I log into my, I'll just do a quick refresh. I log into my Azure App Service plan here. I look at the plan I created earlier and I go to scale it up. Then you'll see that while each of these different tiers shows the price I have associated with it, because I updated that free tier to have no cost, it now shows as having no cost here. You can set the price that your tenants pay for these services. You're not beholden to Microsoft here. You set the rules. You set the pricing. And then one last very interesting thing within the app service in Azure Stack here is this concept of custom software. So when I go to my worker tiers here and I deploy this new gigantic VM here, and it's being deployed, what it does is it creates a new virtual machine. It installs the operating system on it, the 2016 data center image, which I've defined here. And then it installs a whole load of other software on here. It installs a bunch of different frameworks, a bunch of different tooling. It'll install various versions of JavaScript and .NET and Ruby and PHP and Python and all these different things that you're going to need to run an app service plan. And that's exactly the same way as it works in Public Azure as well. The difference here is that in Public Azure, again, you're stuck with what you're given. What Microsoft chooses to put onto those virtual machines is what you get. If you have an application that needs custom libraries, for example, a custom Oracle library, and you want to move that into the Azure App Service, you can't do that. You're going to need to rewrite it to work with what you're given within the context of the app service there. Now, there is one way you can get around that, and that's by containerizing your application, and you can put whatever dependencies you want inside that container and move that into the Azure App Service, and that's possible. But at that point, it's not really a lift and shift. It's not an immediate move to value. There's work that you have to do. It's almost a refactoring activity. And that's not really what we're looking to do with the Azure App Service most of the time. Now, within Azure Stack, what we can choose to do is create custom software. So I can choose to add MSIs or zips or executables or DLLs to my Azure Stack worker tier images here so that when I create a new worker tier, that custom software is going to get installed automatically. That could be specific libraries that I need to be available. It could be a specific version of Java, for example. There are all sorts of things which I can make available on these virtual machines that you just can't do easily in Public Azure. And one of the great value adds of Azure Stack here is that it is consistent, but it also extends. It gives you new capabilities. It allows you to get the value that you need from the Azure App Service, but without adding additional overhead to you. So the process for installing this custom software doesn't have you logging onto these virtual machines and manually installing it. All you have to do is provide the app service with the installer, with the wrapper, with the DLL, and it's going to take care of that for you. It's going to install that on those VMs. It's going to make it available. It's going to manage the load balancing. It's going to do everything that you need to give you that application consistency that you need to be able to take something that's running on premises just now in IaaS, in virtual machines, move it into the app service, elevate yourself away from managing those virtual machines, take advantage of new features like deployment slots and scale sets and backing up your application data there, and all sorts of great and wonderful features that are available within the Azure App Service without any need to refactor, without any need to change what you do or how you do it from an application perspective. And for me, that's one of the most unique and interesting things that we can do in Azure Stack today. It's this concept of you're not beholden to Microsoft because your Azure Stack is yours. You choose what you want to do. If we go back to look at our worker tiers, we're going to see that the gigantic SKU is still provisioning here, but actually even once it's provisioned, that's not going to be available to my tenants yet, and we can also see that my 10 large ones are currently on their way as well, so those are finished provisioning, they're available. If I go into the SKUs section here, then I can choose what worker tiers are associated with these different SKUs. So I could say, actually I want to have a new family here. I'm going to have this mental, because that's a good Scottish word. This is going to be the M series. It's going to be green. There are going to be dedicated workers. It's going to contain just the gigantic ones. And here we can also configure what features are available. So if we go back to the Azure, my Public Azure here, remember, as we went through these different tiers here, different features unlock. These are also controlled by you in Azure Stack. You choose for this new tier here, do you want to have custom domains on? Do you want SSL? How many slots do you want people to be able to use on this? Let's have it unlimited. Let's have unlimited workers. Why not? You manage this. You control it. The world is your oyster. You choose what quotas you want associated with these things here. If you want to control the network bytes in and out, you can do that. You are in control. This is your Azure Stack. We'll create this new SKU here. Wait for it to create. Once it's created, we can immediately start making use of that. So if I go back to my app service plan here, and I refresh this, and I go to scale this up, you're going to find that there is a new instance available here. Now, there are not enough available instances yet because the one which I'm deploying is still deploying. If we go back to the worker tiers tab here, the other thing to be aware of really is the difference between these shared worker tiers and dedicated worker tiers. A shared worker tier allows multiple tenants to deploy their applications into that tier, and you get an economy of scale there. Now, in Public Azure, this is used for the free and shared and very low-end tiers. In Azure Stack, how you use it is entirely up to you. It's also the tier which hosts your Azure Functions serverless computing in Azure Stack. The pricing model is different for each of these, so that's something to be aware of as well. When you deploy these virtual machines in Azure Stack, there is a charge associated with them. So you pay per vCPU provisioned, effectively, and it's around about $40 per vCPU per month to have a VM here for the app service. Now, in the shared model, as soon as that VM is deployed, you start getting charged by Microsoft for it. In the dedicated model here, you're only charged for them when they're actually in use. This supports the whole concept of scalability. So if I have 10 instances available, but my app service plan is only making use of one of them, then I'm only going to get charged as an admin for one of those VMs. The others are sitting there ready. They can be instantly scaled into, but I'm not charged for them until they're actually in use. And that's actually really powerful. It's a way of taking advantage of cloud scalability and cloud economics and the instant provisioning on premises in Azure Stack, just the same as you would do in Public Azure as well. Hopefully that's given you a decent insight into some of the tasks and capabilities and unique features available within Azure Stack that you don't get within Public Azure, why you might want to put an application into Azure Stack versus Public Azure if it needs large scale, in addition to some of the other more common Azure Stack use cases such as regulatory compliance requirements, lack of bandwidth, lack of connectivity, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much for your time and rapt attention today. Once again, you can hit me up on Twitter at Kenny Lowe, and I look forward to any questions you have about Azure Stack, about the Azure App Service, or just about life in general. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.